Hello everyone. So in this video, we'll talk about Anaxagoras' theory of the mind. Now this is something, as we said in the previous video, was something that he brought to the table, and it's pretty exciting because it then starts holding a very sort of big place in the history of philosophy, and for Plato and then Aristotle and everyone, and then continues on. So what he is basically sort of positing is that first, I mean, we'll talk about that later, the theory of matter, the idea that there is a mixture of everything and everything. There's some kind of an infinite matter without any sort of particular few elements to which everything can be reduced, and we'll see how he works that out, and that the mind sort of is there to set everything in order. The task of the mind is to be an ordering principle for everything. So I will read out a couple of fragments for you in which he talks about the theory of the mind. So fragment 12, which is the biggest one, where he says, all other things have a portion of everything, right? So everything has a portion of everything, but mind is infinite and self-ruled, right? So the mind is something separate from all matter that you have, because it is infinite, but also rest of the matter will be, but right now we're just talking about mind, and self-ruled, right? It is not ruled by anybody else. So you have these now distinctions between one that rules itself and one that is ruled by the one that rules itself, right? So there is this hierarchy that is being created, and is mixed with nothing, but is all alone by itself, right? So it is unmixed. It's almost, he's not really saying that it is incorporeal entirely, right? It's still a kind of material sort of being that mixes with things, but it is almost incorporeal because it doesn't mix with everything else in the same way, and it is all alone by itself, right? So it is separate from matter. This mind is something that is separate from matter. For if it was not by itself, but was mixed with anything else, it would have a share of all things if it were mixed with any, right? So the idea that the reason he's proposing this is that he's saying that if it was mixed, then it would have a portion of the thing that would be mixed with, and it would not be pure. There's some kind of a purity of the mind that he's trying to find out here, right? For in everything, there's a portion of everything. And we'll talk about that in the theory of matter, but just to give you an idea that everything in the world contains some portion of everything, right? There is this all. I think he says something like panti pantos nst or something. I'm quoting from memory, which is not actually very good out here. But yeah, so he says something of that sort. En panti pantos moira nst, right? In everything, there is a portion inside of everything, right? So there's this idea of there being everything inside everything. So he says, and the things that were mingled with it would hinder it so that it could control nothing in the same way as it does now, being alone by itself. For it is the finest of all things and the purest. It has all knowledge about everything and the greatest power, right? So the mind is the finest. So as I said, it's not incorporeal. It is just a very fine and subtle substance, which is the finest of everything. And the purest, and it is all-knowing, like this Xenophanes' sort of theos, right? All-knowing, and all-controlling, right? So this one is all-knowing, all-controlling. So it very much, actually, now that I think of it, it does sound like Xenophanes' theos, God. Right? Both the greater and the smaller that have life, right? Everything that has life, right? Mind controlled also the whole rotation so that it began to rotate in the beginning, right? And this idea of rotation will come back. And last time with Empedocles as well, we talked about this vortex of love, right? It forms a vortex when it mixes things together. And with Anaxagoras, it's a very important idea of this vortex, of this rotationary movement. And he will talk about the kind of movement, you will have a sort of a rotation throughout. And it becomes extremely important with the atomists later on. Right, so mind controlled the whole rotation so that it began to rotate in the beginning. So the beginning of the rotation is through mind, because otherwise it would have been inert matter. And then that's why Aristotle would again place him in the second group of people who have both the material cause and the efficient cause, right? Formal and final, again, no, like we talked about it last time with Empedocles. So we are not very clear about the formal and final causes out here. But yes, material and efficient causes are here. And he says, it began to rotate first from a small area, but it now rotates over a wider and will rotate over a wider area still, right? So it's some kind of a centrifugal motion. It sort of starts small and then goes wider and wider and wider and wider, right? And the things that are mingled and separated and divided off are all known by mind, right? So the mind knows everything that is in there and that thing that is rotating. And all things that were to be, those that were and those that are now and those that shall be, mind arranged them all, including this rotation in which are now rotating the stars, the sun and the moon, the air and the aether are being separated off. Yeah, we'll talk about the cosmology later, but so the mind is rotating everything, so everything is being controlled by the mind. And this rotation causes separating off, right? So the rotation is the cause of the separating off. And the dense is separated off from the rare, the hot from the cold, the bright from the dark, the dry from the moist. But there are many portions of many things, and nothing is altogether separated off, nor divided one from the other except by mind, right? So the mind is the one that is doing the separating off and the division, right? And also, mind is all alike, both the greater and the smaller quantities of it, while nothing else is like anything else, but each single body is and was most plainly those things of which it contains the most, right? So you can see how powerful this mind is, which starts the motion, then controls the motion throughout, and controls how the motion goes. So everything is created by the action of this mind, which controls everything and knows everything, right? There is another fragment, so we have fragment, there should be fragment 11 as well. Yeah, fragment 11 was what I was quoting earlier, where he says, en panthi panthos moira en esti, he says, and since the portions of the great and the small are equal in number, so too all things would be in everything. But yeah, we'll get to that when we do the theory of matter. Then fragment 13, where he mentions, and when mind initiated motion, so again this idea of mind initiating motion, from all that was moved, mind was separated, and as much as mind moved, all was all divided off, and as things moved and were divided off, the rotation greatly increased the process of dividing. Right, so again this action of rotation and division, and the creation of things by rotation, and I think there's one in which he talks about the speed of rotation as well. Yes, fragment 9, where he says, as these things rotated thus and were separated off by the force and speed of this rotation, and the speed creates the force, right? So it started off rotating, but the speed is what is creating the force, and their speed is like the speed of nothing that exists now amongst men, but is altogether many times fast. So the initial creation of the world is through this rotation and the speed is something that we cannot imagine. It's extremely fast, right? Right, and the final one, this is fragment 14, where he says, but mind, whichever is assuredly even now where everything else is too, in the surrounding mass and in the things that have been either aggregated or separated, right? So it is in everything, in all masses and everywhere, yeah? Okay, enough of reading fragments, let's analyze them, right? So what do we know about this mind? We know that this mind is conscious, it is intelligent, its judgment, its knowledge, its controlling power, its power of the mind doesn't have any limitations, right? It is omnipotent in that sense. It is omnipotent, omniscient. The thing is that it is not a thinking being, so benevolent is missing from this list. So not exactly God in the same sense, but close enough. We are getting there. It is completely separated off from matter and entirely homogeneous. So it is composed of only one thing, this really tiny, subtle, thinnest material, as he says, right? And self-consistent. So it is self-consistent, it is self-ruling, while the things that it controls, this mind controls, show infinite variety. So the nous controls a world which shows infinite variety, while the nous itself is self-contained, separate, and all-controlling and pure, right? So it is a very nearly incorporeal substance that is contrasted with matter, right? That's what we know about it. So this it's still material though, right? So this is something that continues to remain. That it's not an incorporeal, immaterial thing. It's still a material thing, and it's a matter that moves other matters. Then we know that it rules itself, it is self-governing, and it is responsible for all movement of matter, right? So all matter moves because of the movement of this movement caused by this mind. And it is what sort of introduces order, arrangement, rational order, cosmological order, cosmogonical order. So the sun, the moon, the stars, the air, the ether, the water, everything sort of is through the arrangement of the mind. And these come from this rotation, this circular motion that we see, which starts in the middle and then goes outwards, like bigger and bigger and bigger. And even as the world gets bigger and bigger, it has control over the whole thing, right? So it seems to control everything, and especially everything that has life, if you remember. So it has special control over organic matter, which means that within us there's this mind which is also controlling. And so in that sense, it is something like the soul, right? The psyche that we were talking about. So the world soul, the control of all matter, and special control over all living beings, and the soul of the living beings is also being controlled. So it is what causes life, right? In that sense, it's the animating principle. So that's how we move by ourselves. So when we are moving, actually, maybe we are marionettes. We are these puppets controlled by the mind, which is a scary thought. Well, nous, that's a word that you have in paranoia, and para means sort of like outside or beyond, like in the same way that this mind is. So paranoia is being controlled from outside. So I mean, if you're paranoid, you're probably right according to Anaxagoras, because you are being controlled by this mind outside, right? And then when he says this mind is something infinite, apeiron, the word he's using. So it is apeiron, it is self-ruling, it is unmixed, mixed with nothing. So what is this apeiron? Now, we have done this apeiron a lot with Anaximander, the other Anax. So you can see the influence of Anaximander, Anaximenes, so he liked all these Anaxes, the lords. Right, so the other apeiron, so what is this apeiron? So this apeiron is, if you remember, this indefinite, this infinite thing, and indefinite, infinite in extent, right? This mind is in extent like indefinite and infinite, and it is wherever matter is. So wherever you will find matter, you will find mind. It's not mixed with it, but it is like, think of it as a film layer on top of everything, maybe, or inside everything, and it's still in this pure form. If you think of it as a soul, then everything is ensouled in a similar way by this mind, except now this mind is being thought of as a separate thing. So while with the Milesians, if you remember, you had water itself which would move. So we were all composed of water, and so it was monism of the sort in which, the water or apeiron or air or whatever, that's what we were in a sort of changed form, in a different sort of like accident of it, the same substance with a different accident. And so the motion was of water itself. Here, the motion is through a separate principle, right? It's not exactly the outside forces of Empedocles, because with Empedocles, the forces are outside. You have the love and strife, which are working on things. But with Anaxagoras, the forces in some ways are inside but unmixed. Right, it's unmixed with the rest of us. So if we have, for example, if it's our animating principle, if you think of it as our soul, then it is apparently inside us, but it's also not mixed with anything else. So in that sense, if matter sort of disintegrates, the soul would still remain because it is pure and unmixed, and it will still remain homogeneous. So it is not something that can be that sort of would disintegrate in the same way with the rest. Right, so it is indefinite in extent. It is composed of particles. Again, as I said, it's not entirely incorporeal. There is some corporeality to it, and you'll see that with the atomists as well. When they talk of the soul, there is a corporeality to the soul, but there they go one step further, that it can disintegrate. Here, it cannot. Right, here there is no disintegration of this animating principle. So it is composed of infinite number of particles. It is also infinite in time, because it's there from the very beginning. It is what started time, actually. So if you think of time as being related to movement, then what started time was the action of this mind, which initiated things. And it exists, and it exists forever. It exists like throughout time. it doesn't have any internal boundaries because it is homogeneous, as you saw, right? It's all alike. And we will get to this cool word, which you can test for your spelling bee, which is a homoeomerity, which is containing like parts, which Aristotle uses for Anaxagoras. So there is this idea of, homogeneity of the mind throughout, right? And as he says, and that's why it is unmixed. The reason it's unmixed is because he says, if it were mixed, it would have a share of everything, because everything contains everything. We'll get to the theory of matter. So everything contains everything. So there is a share of everything in this. This idea that things mixed in the world would have prevented it from controlling anything, right? Because if it were mixed with everything, then it would be too inside, too involved with the material of the world, and it would contain every kind of matter of the world, right? So this realization is pretty important in the history of philosophy, because this is what Aristotle really wanted, right? He wanted an efficient cause separate from the material cause. So the realization that the sort of moving and controlling force, the efficient cause, must be entirely separate from the matter which it moves, right? It cannot be the matter which it moves. I mean, we already see it with Empedocles, with love and strife, but with Anaxagoras, there is a new level to it, because it's not even personalized, right? It's just an incorporeal matter, substance, but it's not matter, right? It is homogeneous in itself and is self-contained, moves by itself, and sticks to itself, probably like a Parmenidean substance. So it is entirely separate from the matter it controls, and this is a pretty important sort of step we'll see in the history of philosophy, because this will influence a lot of, or rather this element will be developed by a lot of later philosophers, influenced or not, but they will develop this element. Right, so he says, it's the finest and purest of things, if you remember, and has all knowledge of everything and has the greatest power, right? So it is, as I said, it is a kind of Xenophanes' God, except now it is an impersonal, it's not called a God, it's just a nous, right? It's a nous, and it's going towards incorporeal. It's really going towards incorporeal. So, and if you remember the other part which we already talked about, everything that has life, both greater and smaller, it controls, the mind controls. And it controlled the whole revolution, so it controlled how it started, and it made things revolve in the beginning. So again, this other thing that, is introduced by Anaxagoras is that there is a beginning of time, right? Unlike Anaximander, where it is infinite, there is no beginning, there is no end. Here, that everything started from a state of rest, like everything was in the beginning in a state of rest, into which motion was introduced for the first time, and this motion was introduced by the mind, right, by this nous. So, and after that it becomes mechanical though. Because if you notice, the movement is rotationary. So you have this idea that once you have the initial push, then the revolution will continue, and it will continue on its own momentum, and it will gain momentum. Remember, the speed increases, and there's a great speed. And so when it comes to material things, we're not talking about life, the things that are alive. You have a kind of mechanical motion that is seen. But when it comes to living beings, you have an element of the mind in each living being. So it has a more micromanagement control upon all the living beings, right? So in each of the living beings, you have this controlling mind, animating mind. It also sort of is what causes us to reason. Right? It's what causes us when Aristotle says man is a rational animal, so maybe it contains a rational part of the mind more than the other animals too. I don't know. For Anaxagoras, he's not really making this distinction, and it remains separate from this bodily substance. So this is the theory of the mind, which, I mean, to discuss it further, we really need to do the theory of matter, so I'll do that in the next video now. But it gives you an idea of this all-controlling mind, which is still not completely incorporeal, but incorporeal enough to not mix with the rest of corporeality, with the rest of matter, which started the world. The world was in complete rest, and it initiated motion, which then continues mechanically. But then it also is there in each of our minds, and then controlling us individually, and is what gives us life and intelligence and reasoning and all kinds of things. Right? So this is the theory of the mind. Great. Thank you.